I am Ryan McKnight, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 57 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This is the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, July 6th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we cover July to November of 1839. We start with a discussion about how scarce documentation is for this blackout period of Mormon history, and what it means for historiographies which cover this time period. After that, Joe tells us how we can tell if a spirit is from God or from the devil, which harkens back to his magical occult roots. After that, we take an extract from Bloody Brigham Young's manuscript history to follow the travels of the 12 as they made their way closer to boarding a ship for England. After the history, we debut an exciting new segment to leak off the church, and then we get into some of the church's new face of homophobia and discuss just how their new stance on the LGBT community really is. Spoiler alert, the church is still led by a bunch of Red Scare bigoted octogenarians who are on the wrong side of history. But before we get started, it is our Patreon pledge month, leading up to the live show at Squatters Pub in Salt Lake City on July 29th after Sunstone. We've had an influx of support from some of you amazing listeners who've taken the 90 seconds to sign up at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and personally, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. For as little as $1 an episode, that's less than the price of a 110-degree soy latte at your favorite coffee outlet, you can contribute that little bit of pocket change every month to keep the research going and keeping us in a state of constant research and development to make the show better every week. And asking for money is a bit of a social taboo, but the social benefits derived from funding research like this is a long-term investment, and that's what you do when you support this show. But we aren't just asking for some of your hard-earned cash in exchange for an intangible claim that you're funding research, because patrons of the show get access to tons of exclusive content. You get bang for that buck per episode. When you sign up at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, you get access to extended edition episodes, Patreon exclusive shows, extended conversations with guests, and you even get an invite to join the Namo Home Evening monthly Google Hangout on the first Monday of every month. Each month has a featured guest who we all get to just bombard with our questions. This week, you'll notice an extra episode in your regular podcast feed, which is June's Namo Home Evening that we had with friend of the show, Heretic Woman of the Atheists on Air Beyond the Trailer Park podcast. All of the Namo Home Evenings go up in the Patreon feed, but this is a little bit of a teaser to show everybody just what you're missing out on if you don't support the show. And of course, patrons will also see this month's Namo Home Evening in their Patreon exclusive feed, which was with friend of the show, Jonathan Tyndall of the Secular Stories podcast. Next month, we hope to have on Marissa McCool, author and host of Inciting Incident podcast and 1,000 other projects. So, if you want to join us in those Google Hangouts and join the conversation, or just listen to what we talk about after it airs, now is the time to pledge to support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. That's patreon.com/nakedmormonism to support the show and gain access to our Book of Exaltation to be forever immortalized as a savior of the show. Alright, that's enough begging for this week. Let's get into the episode. Last episode, we discussed at length a development in Mormon doctrine. But how it got there was just as interesting as the doctrinal development, or, evolution itself. The Quorum of the 12 were set to depart for their mission to England throughout the remainder of the summer, but they needed instructions from Joe before they could be trusted out there to convert people to Joe's Mormonism instead of their own proprietary version of Mormonism. Joe had been burned by trusted leaders going off and starting their own Mormonism before, and he didn't want it happening with the Quorum of the 12 in Europe. In the discourse we read from the history of the church, Joe talked about a number of important issues like baptism, repentance, the gift of the Holy Ghost, the Comforter and the other Comforter, and making your calling and election made sure, and, of course, the gift of tongues. An astute listener and friend of the show who I owe a great deal of personal thanks to, Jay Mumford, sent an email in response to the Mormon version of the gift of tongues. And, I related a few stories that I've heard of Mormons getting the gift of tongues when, they give a blessing in a different language which sounds just like somebody else, or it has a miraculous nature to it or something. And I gave my naturalistic musings on an easy explanation for these perceived phenomena, but Jay said something interesting in response to that digression, and this is quoting from his email, quote, "Missionaries having uncanny linguistic abilities, and the first requirement of the skeptical observer is to establish that the extraordinary event actually did even occur in the first place. Now, that could be difficult due to self-motivated comments by the original reporter, the fallibility of human memory, and the concept of the reporter feeling justified in quote-unquote lying for Jesus. But the first step should always be to posit that we don't really know if that supposed event even occurred. And if it did not occur, then there is no need to explain it." End quote. That's a really fair point, and I totally agree. It's something that skeptics say all the time. That which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. When people say that they know something, they aren't always okay with somebody saying that it didn't happen because we don't have evidence of it, though. The people might respond better to a naturalistic explanation that validates their own perceptions, but adds a reasonable explanation. Regardless, I'm glad that Jay sent this in because I really kind of hadn't considered that perspective of, just calling it bullshit. He also said that the Pentecostal version of babbling in tongues, that's known as glossolalia, I think that's how you pronounce that, and I didn't actually know that there was a real word for it beyond just babbling. So, thanks to the enlightenment, and of course, thank you for your gift, Jay, because as we speak, the book Moroni and the Swastika is on its way right now, and I'm stoked to consume the information in it. So back to the milk. Before we discussed Joe in the last episode, we talked all about how busy Joe was in moving around the area to visit friends, family members, and other ailing Mormon refugees, while seeing some of the tracts of land that he had already purchased, by and large sight unseen. The Mormons founded a town which Joe designated as Zarahemla. After all of that, we debuted a news segment as part of our Patreon pledge drive as a teaser for the next goal on Patreon, which we're really close to reaching. It can be hard to talk to missionaries, friends, or family members who hold deeply convicted religious beliefs in the church, so these segments will be devoted to small topics of conversation that anybody can easily broach with that TBM loved one. That does it for a filling of milk, so let's bring some meat to the table.
As the scriptures say, they must have milk before meat.
Mormon history in this show, up to this point, has been chronologically driven. It's what we do in this show. It's the Serial Mormon History Podcast for a reason. We compile church history from multiple trusted sources and then tell the story of Joe and the saints as they progress. Most of the history recounted by trusted historians spawn from documents included in the history of the church, supported by other journals, letters, and newspaper clippings. Chasing these documents down is a full-time task and requires a lot of pointed research to find out what we're looking for. But the point I'm trying to get to here is that we've had to shift things a little bit for the year of 1839 to talking about doctrinal developments and public controversy in the church in addition to the historical timeline, because the extant documents telling the day-to-day dealings of the saints are much scarcer during this time. And that shouldn't come as a surprise. Consider everything that was going on with Joe and friends from Liberty Jail in November of 1838 to where we currently reside in the summer of 1839. We won't rehash everything, but suffice it to say, it was chaos. And the structure which had existed in Kirtland and even in Missouri was completely absent from the church. Where the leadership used to meet in designated meeting rooms on the Johnson Farm, the Morley Farm, the School of the Prophets, the Kirtland Temple, or at meeting houses in Far West or Diamond or anywhere else, those organizational concepts had utterly evaporated once Joe was taken prisoner and the saints were driven from Missouri. This meant that the structured meetings with scribes taking minutes and notes on the proceedings just didn't happen. The Mormons were incessant record keepers, but at a time when all church infrastructure was completely broken, much of the record keeping was conducted long after the actual meetings happened, or meetings would happen without anybody there to even possibly record things in the first place. Many of the types of documents historians enjoy from the Kirtland and Missouri years of the church were never even created during the first year and a half the church was headquartered in Nauvoo. Add into this the fact that once the saints were driven from Nauvoo after Joe's death, many documents from this time period were destroyed or didn't make the trip across the plains to Utah to be included in later publications of the history of the church. I mean, face it, are you going to take a barrel of grain with you or a couple of totes full of documents? What's more important to your survival? The thing is, historians can't discuss history of a time period if documents from that time period didn't survive or simply weren't even created in the first place. You read any historiography of Mormonism during 1839 and early 1840, and you'll see a hole in the documents during this period. We know the major events which occurred, but for most of the meetings, we don't know what was discussed, and historians are left to piece the timeline together based only on letter exchanges and journal entries with very little other documentation to back up a solid timeline. On this show, we've been dealing with this blackout period of Mormon history by discussing the evolution of Mormon doctrine and spending inordinate amounts of time discussing the land purchase agreements as the Mormons were settling. That's because there really isn't much else that's reliably documented to discuss. One of the sources I've always relied heavily upon is H. Michael Marquardt's Rise of Mormonism, and he deals with this blackout period by jumping from the November Court of Inquiry almost immediately to the mission trip of the Quorum of the 12 in September of the following year, punctuated only by a small chapter on the development of church doctrine and history as Joe was recounting it for the published history of the church. And that's just the problem here. There's just not much documentation upon which we can rely for this blackout period. We can look at the history recounted through autobiographies at this time, but actual church meetings and minutes which were usually recounted during the meetings are just nowhere to be found. There's really only a couple of big events to hit on before we wrap up 1839 in the next couple of episodes, and 1840 is a big year. But for the remainder of 1839, it gets kind of hard to track Joe very well. But just because Joe and friends are a bit hard to track in their daily movements doesn't mean there isn't much to talk about for the rest of 1839. As the church moved to new locations, it required development and evolution to adapt. Tracking from the earliest days of Mormonism in New York, the version of Gold Bible Mormonism the few families embraced in living room-sized congregations differs wildly in many ways from the version of Mormonism practiced in Kirtland. As Joe moved to a new area, he had to incorporate the beliefs of those locals into his own church so as not to remove people from their comfort zone. A similar evolution occurred when the saints moved from Kirtland to Missouri. Far West and Diamond are where we begin to see a number of evolutions about Mormon eschatology. The idea of Adam being the temporal incarnation of the archangel Michael and being the first priesthood leader who transferred the priesthood down to his progenitors makes its first appearance. It wasn't until 1838 when in Missouri that Joe claimed that the Garden of Eden was in Missouri and Adam on Diamond was the place where Adam and Eve were banished to after the fall and made sacrifices on altars. Now, to illustrate this evolution, when the saints began to settling Missouri from Kirtland in 1838, let's read a really quick excerpt from Benjamin F. Johnson's autobiography. You'll find a link to this in the show notes. Quote, On our arrival at Diamond, our camp was pitched upon the town plat which had been just surveyed by the direction of the prophet, and of course each one was anxious to obtain the most eligible or first choice of lots. As I was young and unmarried, my choice would come near the last under the rule of oldest served first. So when it was my choice, I found I must take the top lot on the promontory overlooking the Grand River Valley, or go further away and lower down than I wished to. So I chose the upper, which at first appeared rocky, but which made the other lots appear almost enviable. When, after a few days, the prophet accompanied us to this spot, and pointed out those rocks as the ones of which Adam built an altar, and offered sacrifice upon this spot, where he stood and blessed the multitude of his children, when they called him Michael, and where he will again sit as the Ancient of Days, then I was not envious of anyone's choice for a city lot in Adam on Diamond. End quote. This was the first time Joe had focused on anything north of Independence, Missouri in a theological sense. And it only came when he was wandering around the area himself and pointing out some cool rocks and telling Benjamin Johnson here that, his lot really isn't all that bad because those rocks that are covering his lot were actually altars used by Adam, who was actually Michael the Archangel. This represents an evolution of Mormon eschatology and Mormon doctrine. But the thing about the move to Nauvoo is that Mormonism didn't have to evolve to accommodate a new population. Nauvoo was fertile ground for a new city just as much as it was a clean slate for new theological developments. So let's do what other historians have done to fill this blackout of documentation and continue to discuss the further evolution of Mormon doctrine, which was ramping up to a very magical level at this time. This is where Joe invokes more expertise from his past life of occult treasure digging and staring at a rock in his hat while, I think, tripping balls as a development in Mormon theology. In July of 1839, Joe told us some interesting properties concerning spirits. He was kind enough to give us a litmus test for whether a spirit is of God or not. A teaching which has actually perpetuated through today's doctrine. We'll talk about the possible origins of this idea in a minute, but first, let's set the battlefield by reading exactly what Joe claimed. He was warning the apostles prior to their departure for England that many of his trusted church members had left him for the road to apostasy, and he begins by warning them that they better not do that same shit while they're in England or he's going to be really angry. But then he goes on to describe how you test whether or not spirits are from God. Now I'm reading this from the Dan Vogel edition of the History of the Church, Volume 3. This is beginning on page 351. Quote, I will give you one of the keys to the mysteries of the kingdom. It is an eternal principle that has existed with God from all eternity. That man who rises up to condemn others, finding fault with the church, saying that they are out of the way while he himself is righteous, then know assuredly that that man is in the high road to apostasy, and if he does not repent, will apostatize as God lives. The principle is as correct as the one that Jesus put forth in saying that he who seeketh a sign is an adulterous person. Yeah, don't seek for signs. And that principle is eternal, undeviating, and firm as the pillars of heaven. For whenever you see a man seeking after a sign, you may set it down that he is an adulterous man. About this time, in reply to many inquiries, I gave an explanation of the priesthood and many principles connected therewith, of which the following is a brief synopsis. The priesthood was first given to Adam. He obtained the first presidency and held the keys of it from generation to generation. He obtained it in the creation before the world was formed, as in Genesis 1:26 and 28. He had dominion given him over every living creature. He is Michael the Archangel, spoken of in the Scriptures. Then to Noah, who is Gabriel, who stands next in authority to Adam in the priesthood. He was called of God to this office, and was the father of all living in his day, and to him was given the dominion. These men held keys, first on earth, then in heaven. Then after that, we get into the Mormon version of creationism, which is only slightly varied from general Christianity, but it's important to talk about the magic roots. Quote, The spirit of man is not a created being. It existed from eternity and will exist to eternity. Anything created cannot be eternal, and earth, water, etc. had their existence in an elementary state from eternity. Our Savior speaks of children and says, "Their angels always stand before my Father." The Father called all spirits before him at the creation of man and organized them. He, meaning Adam, is the head and was told to multiply. I've heard from many Mormons that believe in some version of creationism. This is what they believe, that everything in the world existed in an elementary state and then God just organized it. That's how they can explain that, dinosaur bones were floating around in space and then God just organized them together on the planet and then he just buried those underground, basically. So it's, like I said, it's kind of a Mormon version of the general creationism myth, but it does have magical roots. But after this, we get into why Mormons have such a hard time changing anything when it comes to the priesthood, like, giving it to black people or to women people. Quote, "The priesthood is everlasting. The Savior, Moses, and Elias gave the keys to Peter, James, and John on the mount when they were transfigured before him. The priesthood is everlasting, without beginning of days or end of years, without father, mother, etc. If there is no change of ordinance, there is no change of priesthood. Wherever the ordinances of the gospel are administered, there is the priesthood." End quote. Now this is when it gets to the important part that has held true throughout the church even today. And the reason I'm pointing this out, and we're spending a fair amount of time on it, is because many of Joe's teachings from the beginning of the history of the church have been altered, modified, or altogether forgotten since his time as prophet. Joe was an ideas guy, but Brigham Young was a manager who operated well inside predetermined parameters. Once Joe put together the beliefs system, Bloody Brigham just needed to stick with what Joe taught and everything was good, making slight alterations. When Bloody Brigham stepped outside of those parameters, things got weird and dogmatic, and the church was forced to change after Brigham Young's death. The Adam God doctrine, blacks not having the priesthood, allowing for mixed marriages, blood atonement, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot more once we jump into the Utah years of the Brighamite Church, but all of those doctrines he taught have since been changed. The point is, once Joe was working with the clean slate of Nauvoo, he can incorporate things from his previous life and call them a development of doctrine, and they stuck around as common Mormon teachings which believers know of or believe in today. And one of those is as follows, quote, "We may look for angels to receive their ministration, but we are to try the spirits and prove them, for it is often the case that men make a mistake in regard to these things. God has so ordained that when he has communicated, no vision is to be taken but what you see by the seeing of the eye, or what you hear by the hearing of the ear. When you see a vision, pray for the interpretation. If you get not this, shut it up. There must be certainty in this matter. An open vision will manifest that which is more important. Lying spirits are going forth in the earth. There will be great manifestations of spirit, both false and true. Being born again comes by the Spirit of God through ordinances. An angel of God never has wings." That's an interesting point of Mormon doctrine. An angel doesn't ever have wings. Some will say that they have seen a spirit, that he offered them his hand, but they did not touch it. This is a lie. First, it is contrary to the plan of God. A spirit cannot come but in glory, and an angel has flesh and bones. An angel has flesh and bones. That's an important part of Mormon doctrine. We see not their glory. The devil may appear as an angel of light. Ask God to reveal it. If it be of the devil, he will flee from you. If of God, he will manifest himself or make it manifest. We may come to Jesus and ask him. He will know all about it. If he comes to a little child, he will adapt himself to the language and capacity of a little child." End quote. This is the beginning of the Mormon litmus test to see if a spirit is of God or is an angel or is of the devil. It doesn't go into more detail here, but apparently questions followed in the meeting which were recounted by Wilford Woodruff, who was the second prophet of the Brighamite Church. So in his journal, which is where we take this from, I'm reading this from page 503 of Marquardt's Rise of Mormonism. In his journal, he discusses the nuances of this litmus test. Quote, "In order to detect the devil when he transforms himself nigh unto an angel of light, when an angel of God appears unto man face to face in personage, and reaches out his hand unto the man, and he takes hold of the angel's hand and feels of substance, the same as one man would in shaking hands with another, he may then know that it is an angel of God, and he should place all confidence in him. Such personages or angels are saints with their resurrected bodies. But if a personage appears unto a man and offers him his hand, and the man takes hold of it and feels nothing, or does not sense any substance, he may know it is of the devil. For when a saint whose body is not resurrected appears unto man in the flesh, he will not offer him his hand, for this is against the law given him. And in keeping in his mind these things, we may detect the devil that he deceived us not." End quote. All right, that was kind of convoluted, but let me describe this test proposed by Joe for verifying the origins of a magic spirit. Because that's what this is. Joe's magic worldview finding its way into Mormon doctrine. Basically, if you're in a state of consciousness where a spirit appears in a vision, in order to find out if it's from God, all you have to do is ask the spirit to shake your hand, and the outcome will tell you the spirit's origin. There's 3 possible outcomes. If the spirit shakes your hand, it's a resurrected human with flesh and bone. If it refuses to shake your hand, it's a spirit being from God without a resurrected body, and it will deliver its message without attempting to shake your hand because that's against the rules or something like that. But if you try to shake its hand and it goes for it, but you don't feel anything when trying to shake hands, like your hand just like Caspers through theirs or something, that's a spirit of the devil and you should rebuke it. So I'll tell you, I went down a long goddamn rabbit hole trying to chase the magic origins of this spiritual litmus test thing that Joe proposed. The basic conclusion I can give you after diving down and trying to dig my way back out, it has some really old origins, like ancient origins, which made its way through a bunch of iterations which all played into Joe's magic worldview. The teachings didn't stop with Mormonism either. In D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, he recounts a similar teaching in a book from 1856 called A Transcendental Magic, and this is what he quotes from it on page 226 of his book. Quote, "This reflected a view summarized in the 1856 Transcendental Magic," quoting from the book. "What is commonly called a necromancy has nothing in common with resurrection. The proof of this is that spirits, at least the specters pretended to be such, may indeed touch us occasionally, but we cannot touch them, and this is one of the most affrighting characteristics of these apparitions, which are at times so real in appearance that we cannot unmoved feel the hand pass through that which seems a body, and yet make contact with nothing. The latter phrase about not being able to feel the hand of the specters pretended to be such showed that humans cannot feel those spirits who seek to deceive. This was a message of Smith's 1843 revelation." End quote. Yes, necromancy. That's the technically magical term for what Mormons do today when they perform ordinances for dead people in the temple. It doesn't sound quite so sacred when you paint it with a word that's usually associated with like grave robbers and sorcerers, but that's the world Mormonism was born out of. That's Joseph Smith's magic worldview. It included necromancy. That's the view Mormonism was born out of. So here we are. But this goes to a fundamental understanding of the universe that Joe had. He believed in a version of the universe that nothing can be created from nothing and that everything is eternal. We've read a few inklings into this universal view, but some of the discourses he gave in Nauvoo prior to his death really play this out quite well. And his litmus test for spirits really is a logical conclusion that's internally consistent. But you have to grant a few things to get in the right frame of mind. things which are utterly and laughably not demonstrable, but things in which Joe sincerely believed. Now let me show you the edge of this rabbit hole and try to describe it as best I can, and I'm going to leave a few links in the show notes to some reading which will make all of this seem logically consistent. In a universe created by God, now there's our first non-falsifiable premise, and it doesn't get any better from here, but just hang in there with me. In a universe created by God, which is eternal in nature, no man can be created or destroyed because, well, just grant the secondary premise and it becomes much easier. Inside this deistic eternal universe, human spirits are part of this creation, but are non-corporeal without a body. In order to receive a body of flesh and bone, you have to come down to earth for your intangible spirit to get a physical body, after which you physically die and are resurrected, where your spirit and body are recombined and you have a perfect physical body. Because our universe is ruled by the progression of time, that scenario poses 3 possible states for every spirit. First, a spirit can be in spiritual form in the premortal existence prior to coming to earth to receive its body, meaning that it's a spirit of the Lord. This explains how a spiritual manifestation can be from God, but also refuse to shake your hand when asked because it's against the will of the Lord. That spirit will deliver its message, and then that's the end. The second iteration, a spirit can be a resurrected being who's come to earth and received a body, and who's died and been resurrected. When it appears to deliver the Lord's message, you'll ask to shake its hand, and because the spirit has received its earthly body and as a body of flesh and bones, as Joseph said it, it'll shake your hand just like a human being, illustrating it's a spiritual manifestation sent by God. That spirit in its corporeal form will deliver its message, and then that's the end of the interaction. The third possibility that exists here is a spirit of the devil. Because spirits of the devil can never come to earth to receive a corporeal body, they'll never be able to shake your hand. So you'll ask for the sign and token, and the spirit will kindly oblige by trying to shake your hand, which will just pass right through. That's when you know that a spirit is of the devil and needing to be rebuked. Now, I suppose that a spirit of the devil could just refuse to shake your hand and then you'll think that it's a non-resurrected spirit of the Lord, but that breaks the rules of this whole goddamn circular logical trap and the whole thing falls apart, so just don't ask questions about it. As I said, this whole thing about the 3 possible states of a spirit and the universal model that Joseph embraced, it's logically consistent if and only if you grant the false premises and understand Joe's magic worldview. It doesn't exactly stand up to scrutiny. But that was just describing the rabbit hole without you actually seeing the edge. So now let's walk right to the edge of that rabbit hole and peer down to try and understand a little bit more about the schools of thought which contributed to Joe's understanding of the universe. Throughout various iterations of early Mormonism, Joe was trying to capture the keys of the mysteries of the kingdom. His occult practices, which were included in Mormonism, descended from early systems of belief, which he cherry-picked from in order to make Mormonism unique. The rituals, which descended from ancient Egypt, found later iterations in the Eleusinian mysteries, which informed Hermeticism, which evolved into Kabbalah, included in the Zohar texts. With the Enlightenment, what we call occult magic today found its way into socially acceptable pursuit of knowledge in spiritual alchemy. This further evolved alongside Rosicrucianism, which language finds its way into some of Joe's teachings, and eventually Joe joined the Masons, which were a post-Enlightenment iteration of occultism and magic, from which Joe likely appropriated the ascendancy rituals for use in his temple rituals during the Nauvoo years. For the sake of brevity, that screed skipped over massive swaths of history, just hitting on a few highlights of the most well-known iterations of these groups who were in constant pursuit of divine gnosis and pure intelligence, as Joe called it. You can find a paper written by Lance Owens in the show notes, and it's titled Joseph Smith and the Kabbalah, which actually deconstructs this whole belief system Joe's magic worldview descended from and his mentors throughout his lifetime who contributed some knowledge to this worldview. It may have begun with Joseph Sr., Big Daddy Cheese as we call him, and people like Lumen Walters and Samuel Lawrence and the Whitmers, but during early Mormonism, people like Peter Kerr and Joshua Saksis and later Alexander Nabar all followed some version of belief system which Joe cherry-picked from and incorporated into Mormonism as the great synthesizer he was. As I said, I just showed you the very edge of this rabbit hole and somewhat described a little bit of it. Dive down it yourself if you're up to the challenge. Now, it should be noted that the majority of these schools of thought included some form of a sacrament ritual, which Joe tried to emulate from the earliest days of Mormonism. Before the doctrine of anything that's practiced in the church today, with the exception of baptism, sacrament is the earliest and longest running aspect of Mormonism. And I'll just say, you should always be a bit suspect when a spiritual leader feeds you some of his or her special wine collection before you have a religious experience. But the entire reason we went on this digression is to illustrate how fluid Mormonism was in its earliest days. Joe grabbed little snippets of everything around him and manufactured his own beliefs around the gems that he liked the most. And some of these aspects of early Mormonism still remain in the Brighamite Church today. This may not seem like much of a revelation to most people, but the more I study Mormon history, I see how much it has actually departed from its Smithian roots. So seeing teachings that Joe taught still enshrined in today's Brighamite Church is actually kind of surprising to me. And this is a theme which will repeat the further we get into Nauvoo. Brighamite Mormonism came from the Mormonism existing in Nauvoo, which is different in a number of ways from the Kirtland Mormonism, which is different from the New York Mormonism. So those different versions of Mormonism slowly evolve to coincide as we progress through the Nauvoo years. And then Brigham just kind of took what existed in Nauvoo and ran with it. But to continue on with the actual historical timeline, once Joe had sufficiently prepared the Quorum of the 12 for their departure for the England trip, throughout July to September, of course, they departed in waves, and here we pick up on the manuscript history of Brigham Young to tell us how things went for the group. Things weren't easy, as most of the people involved in this missionary troop were sickly to some degree, some nearly dying, but they had a mission. And here is what Bloody Brigham tells us of their travels once they departed. You'll find a link to his manuscript history in the show notes. Quote, September 14th, 1839. I started from Montrose on my mission to England. My health was so poor I was unable to go 30 rods to the river without assistance. After I had crossed the river, I got Israel Barlow to carry me on his horse behind him to Heber C. Kimball's, where I remained sick till the 18th. I left my wife sick, with a babe only 10 days old, and all my children sick and unable to wait upon each other. The 17th, my wife crossed the river and got a boy with a wagon to bring her up about a mile to Brother Kimball's to see me. I remained until the 18th at Brother Kimball's, when we started leaving, his family also sick. Brother Charles Hubbard sent a boy across the prairie 14 miles to a shanty on the railroad, where Brother O.M. Duell lived. Sister Duell helped the boy to get our trunks out of the wagon. We went into the house feeling very much fatigued. She made us a cup of tea, which very much revived us. We tarried there one night. In the morning, Brother Duell took us in his wagon and carried us as far as Lima, about 12 miles. When Brother Duell left us, he gave us each $1 to help on our journey. A brother then took us into a wagon and carried us to Father Mikesell's, near Quincy. We tarried in Quincy a few days and began to recover and preached a few times. We procured a meeting house close to the Congregationalists, and we began at different hours from them. But taking a notion to disturb us, they rang their bell furiously after we had commenced our meeting. Elder Page was preaching, and he preached so loud as to drown out the bell, and thus brought out hundreds who otherwise would not have come to meeting. We received some little assistance from the brethren. Lyman White, who was General Lyman White in the 1838 Mormon conflict, took us to a one-horse wagon and carried us to Brother C.C. Rich's at Burton, where we stayed overnight. Next morning, Brother Rich carried us to Brother Wilbur's. We tarried overnight, and Brother Wilbur took us in a buggy and carried us to Father James Allred's in Pittsfield, where we remained all night. and Father Allred carried us to the neighborhood where Brother Harlow Redfield lived, where we preached at a small branch of the church. Next day, the brethren carried us on to Scott County to Brother Decker's near Winchester. Now he goes into October 1st. October 1st, went to Lorenzo D. Young's where we tarried and recruited. The 4th, Brother Lorenzo carried us to Jacksonville. We stayed overnight. A sister in the church hired a man and buggy to carry us to Springfield, where we were kindly received by the brethren. Here I was sick and confined to my bed for a few days. Brother Libius T. Kuhn, who was then practicing medicine, waited upon and nursed me. On the 11th, resumed my journey in company with Brothers Heber C. Kimball, George A. Smith, Theodore Turley, and Brother Kimball's father-in-law, Mr. Murray. The brethren had exchanged horses at Springfield, and with a little assistance from the brethren there, we obtained a 2-horse wagon. The sisters fitted me up in a bed in the wagon to ride on, as I was unable to sit up. We traveled 8 miles and put up with Brother Draper for the night. When we went into the house, Brother George A. Smith dropped onto the hearth a bottle containing some tonic bitters, which the brethren had prepared for us because of our sickness. At this, Father Draper was very much astonished and said, "You are a pretty set of apostles to be carrying a bottle of whiskey with you." We explained to him what it was. This appeased his righteous soul so that he consented to have us stay overnight. Just a quick aside, usually a bottle of whiskey with some tonic bitters infused, that was medicinal whiskey. Next morning, we pursued our journey and arrived at Terre Haute on the 17th. Brother Kimball and myself put up at Dr. Modissette's, who belonged to the church. The other brethren put up at Milton Stowe's, who lived in one of the doctor's houses. In the evening, the doctor called in to see them, Brother Stowe being very poor, and the brethren quite ill in health. The doctor expressed great sympathy for them when he returned to his house, relating over the poverty of Brother Stowe and the brethren's ill health. He shed many tears, but he did not have quite sympathy enough to buy them a chicken or give them a shilling, though he was worth some $400,000 or $500,000. Pandering to the rich people in town, of course. In the course of the evening, Brother Kimball became very ill. The doctor said he could give him something that would help him, but the old man was so drunk he did not know what he did do, and he gave Brother Kimball a tablespoon full of morphine. His wife saw him pour it out, but dare not say a word, but believed it would kill Brother Kimball. A few minutes after he took it, he straightened up in his chair and said he felt very strange and thought he would lie down. And on his making a motion to go to bed, he fell his length upon the floor. I sprang to him, rolled him over on his back, and put a pillow under his hand and began to inquire what the doctor had given him. I learned he had given him morphine. Brother Kimball soon came to and spoke faintly and said, "Don't be scared, for I shan't die." We got him on the bed, and I nursed him through the night. I changed his underclothing 5 times, and washed him previous to changing his clothes. I found him covered with sweat, at first like thin honey. This gradually wore out towards morning, and he sweat naturally. He was scarcely able to speak so as to be understood throughout the night. The next day, Brothers George A. Smith, Theodore Turley, Reuben Hedlock, and Mr. Murray started with the wagon and 3 horses for Kirtland, Ohio. The horses had pretty well given out. We gave them what money we had, except $5, and told them to take good care of the team and make all possible speed. If they did not, we would be in Kirtland before them. We tarried at Terre Haute until the 22nd, when Brother Almond Babbitt and Dr. Knight came to Terre Haute to see us. Next day, Dr. James Modisette sent his son and carriage and took us 20 miles. We went from thence to Pleasant Garden with Brother Babbitt and put up Brother Jonathan Crosby, cabinet maker, found a few brethren who were well and in good spirits. We remained there a few days, preaching to the brethren and others who wished to hear. We learned that Brother Babbitt had been preaching through the country with good success and had baptized 5. We tarried till Saturday the 26th, when Brother Babbitt took us in his buggy and carried us 12 miles to the house of Brother Scott, where we tarried overnight. The family was very glad to see us. Next morning, Brother Scott sent his little son John and carried us 15 miles to Belleville, traveled several miles in the rain. We put up at an inn for the remainder of the day and night. I was quite ill, and Brother Kimball sat up with the landlord and his lady quite late preaching to them. Next morning, the landlord rose up early and talked to the citizens about the travelers who had put up with him the night before, and what he had heard them say concerning the gospel. The neighbors flocked in, and many made inquiries, and were anxious we should tarry and preach in the place. The stage came along about 10 o'clock, and we went on our way for Kirtland. While in Pleasant Garden, we obtained some money, so that the $5 we previously had amounted to $13.50. When we got into the stage, we did not expect to be able to ride but a short distance. We rode as far as Indianapolis, paid our passages, and found we had sufficient means to take our passage for Richmond, Iowa. Now, I think that was a typo in this. I think it meant Richmond, Ohio, because they're on their way to Kirtland. Iowa's the wrong direction. When we arrived at this place, we found we had means to take us to Dayton, Ohio, to which place we proceeded and tarried overnight, waiting for another line of stages. We expected to stop here and preach until we got means to pursue our journey. I went to my trunk to get money to pay my bill, and found that we had sufficient to pay our passages to Columbus, to which place we took passage in the stage and tarried overnight. They're sure shilling out a lot of money for these coaches instead of walking. When I paid my bill, I found I had sufficient to pay our passages to Worcester. We tarried till after the part of the day, then took passage for Worcester. When we arrived there, I went to my trunk again to get money to pay our bill, and found sufficient to pay our passages to Cleveland. When we got to a little town called Strongsville towards evening, within about 20 miles of Cleveland, I had a strong impression to stop at a tavern when I first came into the town, but the stage did not stop, so we went on. We arrived at Cleveland around 11 o'clock and took lodgings and remained till next morning. Now we're finally to November of 1839. November 3rd, Sunday, Brother Kimball and I attended the Episcopalian church in the forenoon. While we were walking down the street to the hotel, we met Mr. Murray and learned that the brethren who left us in Terre Haute had just arrived in Cleveland. Mr. Murray was as much astonished to see Brother Kimball alive as though he had seen one risen from the dead. We walked down the street with him a short distance and met the brethren, from whom I learned they had stopped at the tavern in Strongsville, where I wished to stop the night before. They had met with Brother John Taylor at Dayton, where he left a few weeks before at a tavern, very sick, by Father Coltrane, that's Zebedee Coltrane, who proceeded to Kirtland. Brothers Taylor and Headlock got into the stage with us early in the afternoon and rode as far as Willoughby. We proceeded to Kirtland and arrived that evening, where we found a good many friends and brethren who were glad to see us. I had a York shilling left, and on looking over our expenses, I found we had paid out over $87 out of the $13.50 we had at Pleasant Garden, which is all the money we had to pay our passages, to my certain knowledge, to start on. We had traveled over 400 miles by stage, for which we paid from 8 to 10 cents a mile, and had eaten 3 meals a day for each of us, which were charged 50 cents, also 50 cents for our lodgings. In company with my brother John Young, I visited Brother and Sister Kent, my brother-in-law and sister, and found them well and in good faith. There was some division of sentiment among the brethren in Kirtland, many of whom lacked the energy to move to Missouri last season, and some lacked the disposition. Some of the brethren thought that our sickness was owing to some great wickedness we had been guilty of. Now on to November 10th, Sunday. Brother Taylor preached in the forenoon in the temple, that's in the Kirtland temple, and Brother Kimball in the afternoon. We spent our time in Kirtland in visiting brethren and recruiting our health. End quote. This is an incredible saga of the very beginning of this mission troop out for England. And even while the majority of the quorum were deathly ill, they slowly made their way across the country in small groups of 3 to 5 in each group. And finally, after nearly 3 months of travel, they made Kirtland, Ohio a solid stopping point with lots of friends and family before they hopped on a boat to Buffalo. And what's interesting is, this is what was going on with the Quorum of the 12, but if we kind of VoIP back to what was going on with Joe, At this same time, Joe was making his way across a country destined for Washington, D.C., to make an appeal to Martin Van Buren for some redress for what the Mormons had suffered in Missouri. And we're going to have to pick up on Joe and friends on their trip to Washington, D.C. next episode. But, you know, I talked on this a little bit in the last couple of episodes, but I'm still struggling with this concept of Mormon history since I found out about it. Why in the hell would this chaotic time in church history be a good time to send the Quorum of the 12 out on a mission, and for Joe to abandon the saints in commerce and go to meet with the president? Especially when the majority of these people were too sick to even make the trip on foot and had to hire stagecoaches for the entire trip. That $5 that Brigham Young took with him they had when they left commerce was supposed to get them along their way, and then whatever money they were able to gather from the saints along the way, that would be what would pay their passage all the way to Europe. I mean, you know, today we can hop on a plane for a few $100s and we can cross an ocean in a few hours, but this was a legit mission they departed to undertake from July to September of 1839. They wouldn't even get to England until April of 1840, the next year. That's more than half of a year of their mission was devoted to just getting to England in the first place. And when they left commerce in September of 1839, it was a desolate swampland, utterly devoid of any improvement aside from like the 5 houses that the Mormons had purchased along with the land and a couple of shacks that some of the leaders had thrown together to take care of the thousands of sick people. They finally get back from this mission to England in July of 1841. At which time Nauvoo was home to thousands of settled Mormons with dozens of public buildings, hundreds of homes, and even hundreds of non-Mormon settlers who'd flocked to the sprawling metropolis once they saw how well the Mormons were doing on the banks of the Mississippi. But it's still just a baffling concept to me. Most of their earliest travels to get to Buffalo were spent confined in beds for days at a time, punctuated by blowing all of the Quorum's travel funds on these brief carriage rides from one town to the next because they were too weak to walk the distance. This was a terrible time to send away the middle managers of the church, and it created a power vacuum that would be filled by the next yes man who came along. John C. Bennett would be the mayor of Nauvoo upon the Quorum's return in 1841. A lot of things were different in Nauvoo from the summer of 1839 to the summer of 41. Those points merely bolster the claim that there was no worse time in Mormon history for Joe to send the Quorum away on a mission trip, or for himself to abandon the saints in Illinois and Iowa to go meet with a POTUS. Now, it's always a challenge to posit motives on somebody's decision, especially when it's a decision made vague through a century and a half of history. Mormons can point to all of the good that came out of this mission trip and post hoc rationalize it as a decision delivered from on high. But I'm not a historian who is uncomfortable with making assertions about motivations, nor am I a believing Mormon who thinks that this was a decision from on high. So I'm happy to infer my own conclusions about Joseph Smith's motivations for this managerial decision based on the model of Joe that I've constructed in my head. Basically, commerce was a huge pain in Joe's ass. Everywhere he turned, people were asking for direction and guidance and healing from the prophet and answers. More than anything, answers. When he himself was ill for considerable swaths of time throughout all of 1839 because the ague hit everybody. I think Joe was following the basest of human nature and running away from his problems. You know, he had plenty of good reasons to go talk with the president at this time, but I think the reptilian motivations can be boiled down to what Joe often did in times of incredible pressure, running away instead of truly facing his problems. It happened when his second and third kids died, It happened at the end of Zion's camp and a handful of other times, and Joe ran away when the pressure was too much. Now, granted, he collected the affidavits from a number of people who were imprisoned by the state of Missouri in order to petition the president for redress. He and Hiram both complained that they should be compensated $100,000 each for what happened to them. Money which Joe really needed to pay for all the land he was buying up at record speeds. So that constituted a great excuse to get out of commerce and away from the constant nagging of the saints. People were saying, we want answers, and Joe didn't have any answers. Now, I'm not saying in any way that what he did was wrong. He was just doing what his instincts told him to do, and I can't blame him for that. But I guess I'm making a case that Joe wasn't exactly the hero that Mormons paint him as today. He was just a dude doing his dude thing. Mormons often think that Joe never wanted to found a religion, but did because it was his calling, and that some of the things he got into simply got out of hand. While I agree with the latter, I strongly believe that Joe always wanted to have a following of people who would look to him for wisdom and guidance, but he didn't want to deal with all the responsibility and bullshit the job entails. And this is really a microcosm for the grand disparity that exists between Joseph Smith the prophet and who the real Joe Smith was. And unfortunately for the church, they can't run from Joe the way he ran from anything that seemed to cause him problems. We are officially debuting a new segment that I think you guys will really enjoy, and I'm excited about it. For this segment, we're going to have a recurring correspondent to help us sift through the skeletons lurking in the closets of that great and spacious building in Temple Square.
I'm Ryan McKnight, and welcome to the Mormon Leaks Minute.
So many answers and assurances can come through daily searching and studying the scriptures, and with sincere and pleading prayer. But there are no such promises on the internet.
As you heard Ryan say, welcome to the first installment of the Mormon Leaks Minute. What we're doing here is inviting on the correspondent Ryan McKnight of MormonLeaks.io fame to talk about some recent or maybe profound Mormon leaks that are being released through his website. Ryan, welcome to the segment.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on and becoming a correspondent. Now, the idea behind this is to just bring you on, once every month or maybe twice a month to have you talk about a Mormon leak that's coming out or has recently come out that might pique our interest in some way or another. And maybe we can talk about, maybe how the church is taking on these or their response to these various leaks. I know they've been kind of historically silent to your leaks so far. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, since I think the last time we talked about the bubble chart that they tried to take down, and it's been radio silent since then.
Amazing. So, you did send over a leak that, you just released on Monday. And this, I think, is kind of prescient with what's going on in the LDS Church headlines at the moment. So do you want to tell us a little bit about this leak you sent over?
Yeah, so it's a memo written in October of 2006, written and signed by the lay Hawaii stake presidency. It doesn't say, I guess it's directed to the entire stake, is what it says at the top. So I'm not sure. I assume they read this in sacrament meeting, but I really don't know. And basically it touches on this drink that I guess is common in Hawaii and some of the other Pacific Islands, nations. And it's called kava. And, it says that after deep prayer and thought about it, they've decided that, in order to have a temple recommend, in order to be temple worthy, you must be not be a drinker of kava, and it's effective immediately on the date of the memo.
That is interesting.
It is. There's a lot of angles. I mean, there's so much to unpack on this thing, and the first thing that stuck out to me, to be perfectly honest with you, is that such a strong statement like this came from the stake presidency, and not somebody higher.
Yeah, it wasn't from a general authority or
Right.
something. Yeah, that does seem weird. But let's give a little bit of background for the listeners. So kava is a drink that has been used in, as you said, in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands for thousands of years now. And it has mild sedative properties. It's derived from a root, I believe, and they steep it in water, much like a tea. And according to somebody who I spoke with who tried some of this, it tastes like mud, but they would use it in rituals or when they were coming together for like a peace treaty or an agreement. All of the leaders of the area would drink this drink because it would have a calming effect and things would tend to go more peaceably. So it's a drug, right? And
Yes.
do you think that is why we're seeing this ban on it in this memo?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is similar to yours. I've never tried it, but it is my understanding that it does alter your consciousness. It alters your just like alcohol alters your ability to function at a 100%. So yeah, I'm guessing that they decided. They're probably thinking, well, what's the difference between this and alcohol or some other drug or whatever? And that's probably what their line of thinking was. They probably had members coming to them asking them, am I allowed to drink it? Am I not? They probably had missionaries wondering whether or not they should tell their investigators to stop drinking it, I'm guessing.
Oh, yeah. That is an interesting thought. I love how they cite it here, or the reasons they cite for it. It says, after carefully reviewing the full effects of its modern-day use, especially the harmful impact of its use on marriages and families, and then they go on to say that we've decided that this is not acceptable, and anybody that uses it gets their temple recommend taken away. You can't practice use of the priesthood. It's like drinking alcohol to them, I guess, or using any other type of drug. Or it seems like that's how they're treating it, in my opinion.
Yeah, but it kind of brings me back though to, I mean, it's always been my understanding that local leaders are not really supposed to expound on the set questions that already exist in the temple recommend questions. And it almost seems like they're doing that, because I would imagine that there would have to be a separate question now saying, do you drink kava? Because they don't actually say word of wisdom in the letter. They don't say, we're now including kava in the word of wisdom. In fact, I don't even think word of wisdom is even mentioned in the letter. So
yeah, I didn't see it anywhere.
So it's almost like they're setting up sort of a whole new item, a whole new, you got chastity, word of wisdom, honest with your dealings, and now do you drink kava? That's surprising to me. And going back to what I said earlier, it's also surprising that it's coming from something as low as the stake presidency. And the conspiracy theorist in me, and this is just me talking here. I mean, we know that the church is so rigid when it comes to chain of command. And I almost wonder if the stake presidency was going to their area authorities saying, we need clarification on this. We need clarification. And they just weren't coming back with it, or they were saying, hey, it's a local issue. You guys deal with it. I wonder if something like that was happening. Yeah,
you almost wonder if they did it this way, released at just a stake level, just so it didn't reach any level of PR that anybody would pay attention to, right? If it's just one stake that's banning it, then so what? But if the church releases from the top down a church-wide ban on this mild sedative, well, let's go ahead and ban Ambien while we're right at it. It just so happens that those are in pill form, whereas this is in the form of a tea.
And when Mormon leaks it, they can simply say, well, this was a local decision, and this in no way represents what the church actually believes. They can end up having their cake and eat it too by having the local leadership do it. But this is an issue that carries across many different cultures with other drinks as well. Because I know people who've served missions in Argentina where they have a very popular drink called mate, which I don't think it necessarily alters you, but it is a very strong tea, and apparently has a lot of something in it. Maybe it's caffeine or whatever. And I know that people I've talked to say that there's always this constant struggle in Argentina of whether or not you're allowed to drink mate. and I don't even really know what the official stance is, if there even is one. But I know you also have it in Asian countries where, tea is almost like drinking water over there. And we're talking like green tea. And so they have, this whole sort of balance that they have to play out, over there. And actually, in Spain, where I served my mission, just a really quick 2-minute story that kind of ties into this. This was in the year probably 2000, and I think it was a member of the stake presidency, or maybe even the stake president. We were at their house for dinner or lunch. That's what the big meal there, and he pulls out a non-alcoholic beer and drinks it. And I was blown away by this. I had never heard of drinking non-alcoholic beer, and I come to find out as I start asking around, almost every member there drinks non-alcoholic beer, and I had no idea. I'm like, wow, 7 or 8 months into my mission, and I'm really disturbed by this. So at the very next zone conference, in the zone conferences, typically most mission presidents will take a moment to interview each missionary individually. And my mission president, who's Shane Bowen, who's in the First Corps of the 70 now, I went to him with this issue in my interview, and I said, Mission President, did you know that people here drink non-alcoholic beer? How can this be okay? Is this against the word of wisdom? And he said, it is against the word of wisdom. And he went on to talk about how, even though it doesn't have alcohol, where one of the apostles one time, or one of the prophets one time said, avoid the evil and the appearance of evil, something like that.
Of course.
But then he went on to tell me that he said, you also though need to understand that sometimes the little finer points of the word of wisdom take some time. And if we were to just come in and take away this right away, there could be unnecessary backlash. So it's something that we have to sort of slowly work in. And I'm thinking, I bought it at the time, to be honest with you. But at that point, the church had been around for some 30 years or so, 30 plus years in Spain, and maybe 30 years, we'll say. And it just, I don't know. I also will say that even though he said all of those things and he was very good on his feet to give me those answers, initially he seemed very surprised by the non-alcoholic beer, like he didn't know either. And he was new, by the way. He'd only been there for a couple of months at the time. So it was just a really weird situation where, in Spain, drinking non-alcoholic beer is actually very common among Mormons and non-Mormons, much more common than it is here in the United States. And the Mormons in Spain, including my brother-in-law, who's an active Mormon, the idea that there's something wrong with it is completely foreign to them. I know it's not exactly the same situation as this kava, but it brings the parallels. It makes me think of that, about how different cultures, have their ways of doing things, and the church sometimes rides a fine line on, how to deal with it. And maybe there's not as much uniformity across the board as many Mormons think there are with the church.
And consistency with the original doctrine as well doesn't seem to matter. I mean, because if you do read the actual text of the Word of Wisdom, kava is a root, and it does say in the Word of Wisdom that herbs in the season thereof are okay. And also it does say mild drinks made from barley and grain. And what could be milder than non-alcoholic beer made from barley and grain?
Well, that's a great point. That's a great point.
The consistency doesn't seem to matter with the original doctrine, but I do love how they kind of seal the end of this letter. It says, "Thank you for your sustaining vote and support regarding this decision. We testify that the Lord will bless you as you continue to honor your covenants, obey his gospel, and seek after those things that are lovely and of good report." 13th article of faith. And then it's signed after that. So it does, it does kind of point to the fact that they were using this as kind of a decree. By and large, this is what the law is now. This is the church's stance. Even though we are stake presidents, we are not the actual representation of the church. We're not general authorities or anything. And, it does invoke at the end that the Lord will bless you if you do what we say. But I do find an interesting parallel in something that's going on in the church that was released just a few days ago on the Deseret News. This was published on June 28th, 2017. It says, LDS Church calls for more study of medical marijuana. Now, I don't know if you've been following on this at all, but
Yes.
there is a ballot measure to be introduced to the 2018 Utah ballot allowing for medical marijuana, legalizing it in the state of Utah, which seems odd to me because I know that Mormons are viciously opposed to marijuana, and, you know, that I thought that Utah was going to be the last state in the union to vote on this. But here we are, 2018. This is where it's coming, and this is what...
It's coming.
Yeah, this is what a guy named Eric Hawkins, who's a spokesman for the church, said. Lawmakers across the country have wrestled with whether to legalize the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. This discussion raises legitimate questions regarding the benefits and risks of legalizing a drug that has not gone through the well-established and rigorous process to prove its effectiveness and safety. And what's most appalling to me in that is he not looking at any of the massive body of research that is behind medical marijuana right now, just because there isn't, 40 or 50 years of research on it with, like there are with other sedative-related drugs. It doesn't mean that the research that's coming out or has come out in the past, decade is irrelevant or something.
Yeah.
So it just baffles me. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why we're looking to this guy or to the church to decide whether or not medical marijuana is the right thing when they've been so ass backwards on so many other social issues.
Let's not even sugarcoat this. What we have here is an issue where the church is on the wrong side of an issue, and they are going to hold on to their position for as long as they can humanly possibly do it.
Yeah.
I mean, they have no reason to oppose this. I live in Nevada, which, we just this past, Saturday, July 1st, recreational marijuana became legal. We've had medical for a couple of years. And I'll throw out a shameless plug. I'm going to be at Sunstone at the end of this month, and I'm going to be sitting, aside from talking about Mormon leaks, I'm actually going to be sitting on a panel that discusses the moral, justification to support marijuana. And,
oh, wow.
Yeah. And we got a really diverse panel, from different walks of life. And I'm going to be kind of representing the person that's I've never smoked marijuana ever, or consumed it anyway. Yet I'm a huge supporter of it. And I'm going to be kind of that voice in the panel and talking about how, you don't have to be a user of marijuana to support the legalization. And, but I just see this opposition from the church as sort of, they're just holding on for dear life to a rope that's about to break.
Yeah, and it's completely inconsistent with how the doctrine is set out in the Word of Wisdom, too. It has nothing to do with it. In fact, it flies in the face of what the Word of Wisdom itself says. And I always like to think of it in this way. If we were to, wipe the legal slate clean and say, okay, today either marijuana or alcohol is going to be recreationally legal from here on out, which one would we choose? And I mean, there's no question. Yeah. So I guess the most interesting stance is the fact that the church doesn't seem very concerned with their doctrine as it's set out from their founding prophet, this Joseph Smith that they hold up. It seems like they're much more interested in controlling the behavior and activity of their members by any means necessary. And I agree with you. I think that the rope is definitely thinning.
Well, and Bryce, here's an idea for a future show if you haven't already covered this issue.
All right.
Look up, who's the guy that wrote Jesus the Christ?
I have no idea.
Talmage.
Okay.
Look up Talmage's personal diary. It's available somewhere online. I know someone's linked it to me before. And he actually did all kinds of experimentation as an apostle with marijuana and wrote about it in his journal. So, wow. Yeah, it's fascinating. Look that up and I guarantee you'll get a good show out of that.
I look forward to that.
It's not all positive, but it's also far from negative, his writings on it.
Interesting. Yeah, when I was actually in Kirtland, talking to some people with the Community of Christ, they recommended that I look up one of their apostles, Fred C. Smith, I believe was his name, who apparently had a very expansive, multiple decade-long experimentation process with peyote and various hallucinogenic drugs. And his writings, what I have read of it, I just read a pamphlet that's basically a biography of him that is fascinating to say the least. So oftentimes the little bit of drug use does kind of lurk underneath the surface in the church, but it's I don't think that the church would really espouse these kind of things today. So
yeah.
With that, I think this was a good first installment of our Mormon Leaks Minute. Ryan, thank you for coming on, and we'll have you on in the future. And just to let everybody know, where can they find Mormon Leaks? Where can they find your online presence?
MormonLeaks.io. Click on our newsroom to see our latest leaks. Twitter at Mormon_leaks. Facebook Mormon_leaks as well. And Reddit. We do have our own Reddit, Mormon Leaks Reddit. You can look us up there. And I always post on Ex-Mormon under the handle Fearless Fixer. So those are the main places. And thank you for having me on. And I look forward to our next session.
Likewise. Thank you for doing this. This is going to be a lot of fun. All right, we've gone a little bit long today, but there have been some headlines coming out of the Mormon newsroom that I just can't put off any longer. Let me start off by talking about a video that went viral a few weeks ago about a 12-year-old girl named Savannah who bore her testimony in church. There's a link in the show notes to the video, and we're going to play a brief excerpt from it as a jump-off point for what's going on in Mormon headlines very recently. Because this is a video and it doesn't necessarily translate to audio perfectly, let me set up the scene. Testimony meeting is the open mic meetings in LDS churches have on the first Sunday of every month. This young woman, Savannah, gets up with a prepared scripted testimony, probably because she was understandably nervous, while wearing a white button-up shirt and a red tie. Not necessarily approved church attire for the temple-bound maid in the church. And she shares with the congregation the fact that she's gay and she knows God made her that way on purpose. And I'll just kind of let Savannah take it from here.
Hi, my name is Savannah, and I want to share my testimony with you. I believe I'm a child of heavenly parents. I don't know if they talk to us, but I feel in my heart that they made me, and they love me. I believe I was made the way I am, all parts of me, by my heavenly parents. They did not mess up when they gave me brown eyes, or when I was born bald. They did not mess up when they gave me freckles, or when they made me to be gay. God loves me just this way, because I believe that He loves all His creations. I do not believe He made me, I do believe He made me this way on purpose. No part of me is a mistake. I do not choose to be this way, and it is not a fad. I cannot make someone else gay, and being around me won't make anyone else this way. I believe that God wants us to treat each other with kindness, even if people are different, especially if they are different. Christ showed us this. I believe that we should just love. I believe I am good. I try my best to be nice to each other and stick up for those that are hurting. I know I'm not a horrible sinner for being who I am. I believe God would tell me if I was wrong. I hope someday to go on dates, go to school dances, to hold hands, and to go out to college. I hope to find a partner and have a great job. I hope to get married and have a family. I know these dreams and wishes are good and right. I know I can have all of these things as a lesbian and be happy. I believe that if God is there, He knows I am perfect just the way I am, and would never ask me to live my life alone, or with someone I am not attracted to. He would want me to be happy. I want to be happy. I want to love myself and not feel ashamed for being me. I ask you that.
And that's the end of the video. Did it sound like she was cut off mid-sentence? Well, that's because she was. The bishop literally cut her mic to end her public coming out speech, which was centered around her saying that she knows God made her that way and that God loves her. She wasn't up there describing lesbian sex or calling all children in the congregation to turn gay. She was just saying that she's gay and it's okay. Now, the reception of this video has been interesting to say the least. To give a little background, the video was actually taken and made its way to YouTube a few months ago, where it made a brief appearance and Savannah was interviewed by a couple of local news outlets, but it didn't actually go viral until a few weeks ago when friend of the show Mike Norton, who goes by the screen name New Name Noah, posted the video to his channel, which he tweeted had received a few thousand views within the first 4 hours of being posted. And right now it sits just under 500,000 views at the time of the recording. That's when the ex-Mormon subreddit picked it up, and it went absolutely apeshit. And the following testimony meeting, a number of people made it a point to wear garb to church in support of Savannah, including rainbow wristbands and red ties, just like the tie that she was wearing. Now, I'll be honest, I expected the feedback of this video to fall strictly down on either side of the believing spectrum, with very few believers supporting Savannah to bridge that gap. The comments section underneath the video has about 2,000 comments right now, and in skipping the top 100 or so, people are by and large in support of Savannah and everything she symbolizes. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of comments of Mormons who were utterly perturbed that she would have the balls to grandstand during a testimony meeting, but the homophobia is a Mormon version of homophobia. Not the overt homophobia as stereotyped of the bigoted firebrand Christianity's rife with people holding up signs, say, like God hates fags and stuff like that. But a few of the comments say she shouldn't have done what she did because testimony meeting isn't the place to normalize sin. It's where you go to bear your testimony of God. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but you get the point, but it isn't exactly what she was doing. She says that she knows God made her gay and loves her. That's her testimony of her belief in God. That's the most exciting thing about reading through the comments, is seeing just how many people are in support of Savannah and what she did, or are outright telling the church to go fuck itself. And interestingly enough, what Savannah did may not have been deemed appropriate for testimony meeting, and I won't weigh in on that, but her perspective and continued belief in the church is perfectly in line with the fragile position the church takes on LGBTQ issues. About a year ago, the church launched a new initiative called mormonandgay.lds.org, which attempts to deal with the church's historically bigoted stance on the issue. This was revolutionary for some folks, but was merely a softening of the hard homophobia they'd espoused prior to the mid-2010s. This site has a few videos of people who are gay and Mormon and are okay with it. But the church does take a hard stance that people can live a happy, God-approved marriage with somebody of the opposite sex and just live with what they call same-sex attraction. Hey guys, guess what? If somebody has feelings of same-sex attraction, they're probably gay or fall somewhere on the sexuality spectrum other than cis-hetero. But that's all that the church recognizes as legitimate is cis-hetero. So the church is cool with your same-sex attraction, as they call it, as long as you never act on it. Granted, the launch of this initiative wasn't publicized in the church, and I haven't seen any major updates to the site since the launch, with the exception of adding a few new videos. But here's a quote from it which summarizes the church's stance on LGBTQ issues. It's all about loving people regardless of how God made them. Quote, in an October 2009 General Conference address, President Dieter F. Uchtdorf described God's love. God does not look on the outward appearance. I believe that he doesn't care one bit if we live in a castle or a cottage, if we are handsome or homely, if we are famous or forgotten. Though we are incomplete, God loves us completely. Though we are imperfect, he loves us perfectly. Though we may feel lost and without a compass, God's love encompasses us completely. He loves us because he is filled with an infinite measure of holy, pure, and indescribable love. We are important to God, not because of our resume, but because we are his children. He loves every one of us. And then back to the article, no longer quoting Uchtdorf. God loves all of us. He loves those of different faiths and those without any faith. He loves those who suffer. He loves the rich and poor alike. He loves people of every race and culture, the married or single, and those who experience same-sex attraction or identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And God expects us to follow his example. End quote. Now, like I said, mormonandgay.lds.org is a softening of the hardcore Packer-esque homophobia of just punching people who are gay, but it's not exactly acceptance. It may be considered tolerance at some level, but it's far from acceptance. To drive the point home even further, I'm going to play a clip from the last question of a face-to-face meeting with Apostle Jeffrey R. Holland. And this video was made and posted after the launch of Mormon and Gay. He says at the beginning of the video that he is there as a representative of the church, and he is an apostle. So this is the church's official stance on marriage and what they call same-sex attraction. And by the way, there will be links to everything we're discussing in the show notes if you want to chase this further. To set the scene for what you're about to hear, this was the first of 2 videos the church has produced called Face to Face, where young single adults come together in a huge audience to do a Q&A with the apostles and other general authorities. The first voice you'll hear is the 20-something questioner who's been asking the majority of the questions. Then he sends it over to Pluto McFlappyjowls Jeffrey R. Dodo Bird for the answer. Holland answers by sidestepping the issue and shifting the discourse to talk about chastity instead of same-sex attraction and homosexuality. Now, keep this in mind. The clip is about 3 minutes long, but whenever he says chastity in his bumblefuck of a hastily prepared answer, understand that he actually means that gay people can be attracted to each other, but they can't act on it, implying that they should stay in hateful, unfulfilling marriages with people of the opposite sex because that's what God commands. Those are God's commandments. That's what he's talking about. And another point to make briefly before playing the video, he obviously doesn't understand the science of biology, psychology, and anthropology in general, but he's happy to tell us what God thinks about those things.
Okay, well, we're all sad to hear this, but we only have time for about one more question. So that last question is in regards to same-gender attraction. And as you all are well aware, those who experience same-gender attraction in the church, they encounter... those who encounter this feel alone in the church. They feel scared and they're not sure how they fit into the Lord's kingdom. So if you could meet with them face to face, what message would you share with them?
Let me respond, and if Elder Hallstrom and Sister Stevens want to join in, please. This is a current, sensitive, complex issue for the church. It's something of the time that we're in. But let me say this to begin a response. I think we have talked altogether too much about gender and altogether too little about chastity. The issue is chastity. The issue is not gender. We have written, we have publicized, we have talked, we have put articles in church magazines about attraction. We do not make a judgment about someone's attraction. We don't know why that attraction came that way, and the person doesn't. The one struggling with it doesn't. We don't make any attempt to say why that happened or how it happened. It might be as individual as there are those circumstances out across the church. What we do say is that we teach chastity for heterosexuals, for those with homosexual tendencies, whatever. We just go with what the Lord has declared about chastity and sanctity, the use of the body, and the spiritual impact, because it's at least as much spiritual as physical on sexual relationships. So please, maybe it helps everybody if we could just shift the discourse a little bit to that subject and talk about chastity, about which the Lord has been quite clear and will, I think, continue to be very clear for all people, for all of his children. Now, when that attraction exists, what we ask for those inclined to a homosexual feeling is exactly what we ask for those with heterosexual feelings. I'm talking to a young single adult group, and that is be faithful, be clean, be chaste.
Sorry for playing such a long clip, but that's the problem with people that don't ever conclude a sentence when challenged by a concept with which they're uncomfortable. The thing is, nothing of what he said is acceptance of the LGBT community. The church has softened their public face, but actions speak louder than words. And no action spoke louder than the controversy with the Provo Freedom Festival this last weekend. Every year in Utah, a number of organizations host parades and festivals throughout major population areas. The committee which runs the Provo Parade and Festival is known as America's Freedom Festival, and this is the mission statement on the front page of freedomfestival.org. Quote, America's Freedom Festival at Provo is a private, non-profit, non-political foundation whose mission is to celebrate, teach, honor, and strengthen the traditional American values of God, family, freedom, and country. End quote. At least they used an Oxford comma, so I can't fault their editors, but they surely did put God before family, freedom, and country. Anytime a mission statement includes God next to all those things, I'm instantly skeptical. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because Provo is home to BYU and is known to be the conservative college town filled with young adult return missionaries. You know, the next generation of bigoted church leaders are fostered in Provo, Utah. The reason I bring up America's Freedom Festival is because 2 days before the parade, they canceled participation of one group in the festival. The group is known as Encircle, and this is the mission statement on encircletogether.org. Quote, Encircle functions as a hub for resources that support the overall well-being of LGBTQ individuals. Encircle not only provides a physical space for community gathering, skills training, individual counseling, conflict resolution, and other resources, but will also serve as a literal example of what a typical Utah home that is inclusive of its LGBTQ members might look and feel like. End quote. This is the group that the Freedom Festival pulled from the parade, and instead there was a massive swath of fucking missionaries walking down saying this is what freedom looks like. The Freedom Festival claimed they removed Encircle because the Encircle is a political group and Freedom Festival tries to be nonpartisan. Fuck that. The Freedom Festival made this a political issue when it wasn't one before. Let's call a spade here. The church found out about Encircle being a resource for LGBTQ people, especially for youth, and they considered it a part of the nefarious gay agenda to convert those little Provo kids to being gay. And they made a phone call to the organizers of the Freedom Festival and told them to cut the rope to Encircle, citing political reasons. Freedom Festival says Encircle is a political movement, but just because an issue is wrongly politicized doesn't mean that a nonpartisan, non-for-profit organization like Encircle, who advocates for equal rights, is a political group. That's just like saying that because Freedom Festival includes God in their mission statement means that they're a political group. Can the church and the people associated not see the parallels to the late 1970s? Can they not see that they're on the wrong side of history in this social issue? That brings me back to Savannah. What they did to her is representative of what they've been doing with the LGBTQ issue on the broad spectrum. They put up these political statements saying, oh, they're totally cool with people who don't fall into the cis-hetero category, but as soon as it comes to actual practice, they'd much rather silence the problem and those talking about it than actually deal with the fundamental issue. If a 12-year-old threatens your belief system with a 3-minute talk, maybe your belief system is the problem here. That's going to do it for today's episode. Of course, we do have some new patrons to thank, as well as some pledge edits. Huge thanks to Mars Girl, Pre-Theist, Silly Rabbits Podcast, Abe, Cass and Steven for their brand new pledges, and for a pledge edit from Philip Soliner. Thanks to all of you for pledging to support during our pledge drive month. But of course, there are those of the Book of Exaltation that I need to thank as well. We have Preston, Lynn, Chris and Christy, Tyler, Judy J, Frank, Clara, Clint, Mindy, Matthew, Karen, Shelley, Greg, Andrew, Shane, Thomas, Eric, Dan, Lane, Cam, Derek, Mark, Larry, Scott, Philip, Stuart, Lizzie in the Lab, Jared, Corrine, David, Howard, Brandon, David again, James, Doug, George, Doubting Dogma, and Doonan. Thanks to all of those people who have been supporting and who have pledged to support during this Patreon Pledge Drive month. Without you, this podcast would not be able to go, and we really hope you enjoy the extra content you get exclusive access to on patreon.com/nakedmormonism on the feed there. It's now time to thank the people who keep this show going behind the scenes. First, I need to thank my social media guru, Julie. She does so much help on there, and I really do appreciate that. Thank you to Jason Camo for providing the music in the show used with his permission. Be sure to go to A Lost State of Mind to hear more of his music. Thanks to Craig Keeling for making the amazing artwork that's used in the show. Go to weirdmormonshit.com to check out his blog there. Thank you so much to friend of the show, Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for providing the legal counsel that very necessary to keep the show going. Thanks most of all to all of the patrons once again, and of course, this show owes a huge debt of gratitude from the bottom of my heart to all of the listeners who tuned in once again. Thank you so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. Quote, Preface. This book is a fictionalized account of the true experience of Charlie Wallowing Bull, a Navajo Indian youth who discovered the gospel in an unusual situation and accepted Christ through the patient labors of others who came to love him. His experience is similar in many ways to that of Lamanite brothers and sisters who are accepting the gospel and learning more of it through the Indian Placement Program of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Indian tribes differ from one another as much as white people from different sections of the country do. For instance, the Bostonian can easily be distinguished from the Texan by his speech, his manner of dress, and his behavior. So it is with Indian tribes. Charlie Wallowing Bull is mostly of the Navajo bloodline, and his early childhood was spent in that tribe. A review of some of the customs, traditions, and mores of the Navajo might help us to understand more why Charlie became the way he was until the gospel touched his life. Perhaps he rebelled against many of the old ways of his people. Perhaps many of the Indian ways were so strongly instilled within him that they would always be a part of him. Perhaps when his world became mingled with the white people's ways, he became confused over the conflicts that developed. It might be generalized that it is the nature of most Indians to be quiet and reserved. The Indian is not a slave to time, schedules, and appointments. These are inventions of the white man. The Indian's concerns are in nature the sun, the moon, the wind, the rain, and his crops and livestock. The Indian often has names that seem strange to the white man: singing wind, fast-running warrior, rain cloud, barking dog, etc. Navajos especially do not use their personal names lightly. Their names are almost sacred to them. They prefer their nicknames or American names such as Bill Smith or Harry Jones. Navajo is a name given by the Spanish. The Navajos call themselves Dine, meaning the people. They are unique in many ways. Unlike most Western tribes, the Navajo mounts his horse from the left side, the same as whites. Adult Navajo males, unlike other tribes, often wear a mustache. Fights are rare among Navajos. They do not hold grudges and regard it a sin to lose one's temper. They are not tribe or race conscious. A Navajo adheres rather rigidly to his own tribal code and is governed by it more than he is by the laws of white man. A Navajo never looks directly into the eyes of another, but watches his lips when he is speaking. One should never directly ask a Navajo his name, but should find out through a friend or acquaintance. In the same vein, a Navajo does not like to be asked a direct question. Rather than be wrong, if he is not sure of an answer, he will say, maybe. He does not verbalize his thanks for a favor, but is very appreciative. The Navajo is not very demonstrative, and hardly ever shows affection in public. Early childhood training for Navajo includes respect for his elders, industry, morals, truthfulness, and moderation. Mothers have full jurisdiction over their children above and beyond that of their father. They love their children and seldom whip them. The children seldom cry unless there is pain, sickness, or they are frightened. If children are orphaned or the family cannot care for them, close friends or relatives often adopt them. A Navajo doesn't like to crease a hat. He does not wear it tilted at any angle. He wears it square on his head and uses both hands to place it there. Navajos take pride in their hair, especially the men. If their hair is cut, it is traditional to burn it to prevent witches from using it against them for evil purposes. If a child's hair is clipped, a few long strands are left on top. Navajos may tell a lie 3 times, but a 4th lie would be drastic, because it could lead to their being surrounded and eventually defeated by lies. They are hearty eaters, but not gluttonous. A loud belch or smacking of their lips is not out of place. It may just be showing appreciation for a host's hospitality and good food. Many Navajos spend most of their childhood and youth away from the reservation at some distant Indian school. Most return to the reservation, some do not. They often adopt the customs and manners of the white man, and perhaps some of the white man's vices which they cannot handle as secretively or smoothly as the white man. But the Navajo seldom forgets his traditions, customs, and old religion. So it is a complete change of life when Charlie Wallowing Bull accepts the gospel of Jesus Christ, a change that is not made lightly and does not come easily, but it is a decision which transforms his life positively where everything else had failed. With this background, let us now explore a portion of the life of Little Injun, who is fictional, but might be a combination of many Little Injuns the author has known. End quote. It's from Little Injun, Big Injun, Mormon Injun by Robert Barlow Fox. Copyright 1972 by Horizon Publishers. Apparently, these old, horrendously racist Mormon books from the 50s, 60s, and 70s are a dime a dozen. I picked this copy up for $6 at Eborn Books. Fucking incredible. I cannot wait to read through this antiquated piece of literary excrement. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.